Welcome, dear students. Today we are going to discuss neoliberal reforms in India, a critical analysis. This lecture aims to critically evaluate the neoliberal reforms which were introduced in the Indian economy in 1991. Popularly known as the New Economic Policy, these reforms aim to liberalize the economy, push the markets towards privatization, and integrate them with the global economy. India marked the 30th anniversary of these landmark reforms in 2021 at a time when the economy is experiencing record low levels of growth. In this scenario, it becomes pertinent to understand the genesis and trajectory of these reforms to be able to assess them critically. In 2021, speaking on the 30th anniversary of these historic reforms which were to change the course of history and open up the Indian economy for the world, the then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh said, "Over the last 3 decades, successive governments have followed this path to catapult our nation to a $3 trillion economy and into the league of the world's largest economies. More importantly, nearly 300 million fellow Indians have been lifted out of poverty in this period, and hundreds of millions of new jobs have been provided for our youth." The reform process unleashed the spirit of free enterprise, which has helped produce some world-class companies and help India emerge as a global power in many sectors. The shift in 1991 from an inward-oriented state-led development strategy to a policy of active reintegration with the world economy has been one of watershed moments in the economic, political, and social history of India, having far-reaching ramifications on the people and their lives. Since the inception of these reforms, a lot of debate and steam has generated over whether they can propel India on the path of a higher growth trajectory like it happened in China or other East Asian economies. Unfortunately, in the Indian case, the reforms did not help the economy in terms of employment and productivity growth in the long run, and the power of these changes seemed to have subsided post-2011. This makes the neoliberal economic reforms a very interesting case for students of social sciences, say, to be able to ask this basic question: what made the economic reforms in China to deliver for a long time post its inception, and why the same could not be seen in the case of India? This lecture is divided into smaller parts to make it comprehensible. We shall start by looking at the events preceding the reforms and the state of the economy in 1980s, then move on to the 1990s period and try to understand the changes that were brought about in the new policy shift that took place. The last section of the lecture would be to evaluate the performance of the economy post 2009-10. We shall focus principally on the growth and poverty policies to understand the economic transition in the economy. How and when did it all start? There's a debate in India amongst various economists as of when did a policy shift in terms of the debate around the nature of the state and the degree of its openness take place in the Indian economy. Most conventional accounts of India's recent economic performance associate the pickup in economic growth with the liberalization of 1991. However, it has been investigated by many researchers that this transition to high growth occurred around 1980, a full decade before economic liberalization. According to Montek Singh Ahluwalia, an important member of the team that liberalized India's economy, there were 2 issues that set off the reforms in India. The immediate trigger was the balance of payments crisis in 1991, but the other challenge was the problem of slow growth in the economy post its independence. India was a latecomer to economic reforms, embarking on the process in earnest only in 1991, in the wake of an exceptionally severe balance of payment crisis. The need for a policy shift had become evident much earlier, as many countries in East Asia had achieved high growth and poverty reduction through policies that emphasized greater export orientation and encouragement of the private sector. India took some steps in this direction in the 1980s, but It was not until 1991 that the government signaled a systemic shift to a more open economy with greater reliance upon market forces, a larger role for the private sector, including foreign investment, and a restructuring of the role of government. To understand this question, it would be important to go backwards and understand what happened in the first 3 decades post-independence in the country, and then what made the state rethink its policies and attitude in the 1980s. 2 major accelerations of national income and output stand out in India's economic trajectory in the 20th century. The first took place few years after independence in 1947. From 1950, the growth rate of national income went up from 1% a year that prevailed in the first half of the century to 3.5% a year for 3 decades from 1950 to 1980. Well, though the structural break was a welcome move, for the next 3 decades, no matter what the government tried, it could not go beyond this slow growth rate for the next 30 years, which wasn't enough to make any dent in, say, poverty. India's economic performance during the first 3 decades since independence was christened the Hindu rate of growth, a term connoting a disappointing but not disastrous outcome, and pointed towards a puzzle regarding the performance of the economy. In this first phase from 1950 to 1980, economic strategy largely followed a command and control model. This figure presents a very succinct picture of the growth performance of the Indian economy in the first 3 decades. One of the reasons for the puzzle of the Hindu rate of growth till the 1980s was what has been termed by the Madras statesman C. Rajagopalachari as the license permit Raj. It refers to the various licenses, regulations, and accompanying red tape that were required to set up and run businesses in India between 1947 and 1980. The license Raj was the result of an excessively centralized planned economy, where each and every aspect is controlled by the states and central government. The complicated and convoluted process of regulations and licensing that was required to establish a business in India prior to the economic reforms of 1991 was a major hindrance for the growth of the private sector. One also has to remember, by this time, China had already initiated the market reforms and had already begun to show higher levels of growth on almost all economic indicators. What happened in the 1980s? From around 1980, there was a second marked change of gear to a growth rate of more than 6% for the next 35 years from 1980 to 2015. This was a major achievement that made India one of the fastest growing countries in the world and resulted in a considerable improvement in human welfare. In this phase, economic strategy moved gradually in the beginning and explicitly in the end towards greater marketization. Danny Roderick and Arvind Subramaniam have pointed out some of the specificities of this period. They refer to a marked attitudinal change on the part of the government in the 1980s, signaling a shift in favor of a private sector in a very haphazard and gradual manner through actual policy changes. Second, the shift and the limited policy changes were pro-business rather than pro-competition, aimed primarily at benefiting incumbents in the formal industrial and commercial sectors. Third, these small shifts elicited a large productivity response because India was far away from its income possibility frontier. Finally, manufacturing, which was built up through previous efforts, played a key role in determining the responses to the shifts. This was also a time when the contrast between the East Asian success and the Indian failure was getting hard to ignore. They posit that sometime in the early 1980s, there was a significant attitudinal change towards the private sector from being hostile to mildly supportive on the part of the national government led by Indira Gandhi's Congress Party. Changes to trade regimes and industrial licensing were initiated. The state now actively sought to woo the business and industrial establishment. Significant policy changes during this decade were largely related to some internal liberalization in the domain of industrial licensing. The limited nature of these changes, as well as the form they took, is best understood by appreciating the political logic of Indira's and later Rajiv's efforts. These were aimed to gather support from the business establishment rather than to alienate them. Hence, there was more action where business support existed, for example, in reducing taxes, easing access to imported capital inputs, or liberalizing capacity restrictions than where it did not, for example, in external liberalization. As is clear from the data in this figure, a marked acceleration in economic indicators like GDP growth can be seen from 1980. According to Vijay Joshi, the reforms in 1980s were important, but nonetheless very shallow. There was very little in the way of introducing genuine competition, domestic or international. Significant and planned reforms of the 1990s were the need of the hour. 1991 reforms. What was done and what happened? The balance of payment crisis of 1991 was the immediate trigger for systematic economic reforms in the economy and paved the way for a more decisive change of strategy. The 1991 crisis had manifold roots, central among which is the growing recourse to various forms of external borrowing to finance a series of large trade and current account deficits in the latter half of the 80s. The foreign exchange reserves were also run down to finance the unsustainable external deficit. And in mid-1991, foreign exchange reserves were barely sufficient to meet 2 weeks' import bill. Although an active policy of real exchange rate depreciation in the second half of the 1980s induced good export growth in the late 1980s, it was a case of too little, too late. The value of imports increased at a faster pace than what could be financed by the exports because of the gradual easing of import and industrial licensing requirements after the 1980s. The growing recourse to external borrowing in the second half of the 1980s had led to a substantial deterioration in India's external debt indicators. As a ratio to foreign currency reserves, short-term debt soared to a dangerous 382%, signaling the heightened fragility of India's external finances. The crisis was waiting to happen, and the trigger came in the form of the Gulf War of 1991, and the associated oil price hike tipped India's fragile external finances into a full-fledged, full-blown balance of payments crisis. To manage this crisis, India took recourse to a stabilization program. India borrowed from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and in return accepted the offer of structural adjustment in the economy. The thrust of the reforms was to roll back controls in trade, industry, and finance, thereby increasing the market orientation of the economy. Quantitative import controls on capital goods and raw materials were abolished. Import tariffs were slashed. Investment licensing was scrapped in most industries, and significant moves were made to open up the economy to foreign direct and portfolio investment. This meant a complete change of the state outlook with respect to the private sector and its role in the economy. This complete change of policies had visible effects. liberalization boosted the productivity growth, both corporate savings and investments rose sharply, and a local dynamic entrepreneurial class, which was free of the obstacles imposed by the license Raj, began to emerge. The data on Indian economy shows that during the period from 2000 to 2010, nearly all states grew faster than in the previous decade. As is clear from figure, India shows a spectacular growth post-1980, which continues till 2010-11. According to the noted economist Montague Singh Ahluwalia, India's economic performance in the post-reform period has many positive features. The average growth rate in the 10-year period from 1992 to 1993 to 2001-2 was around 6%. Which puts India amongst the fastest growing developing countries in the 1990s in the world. This growth record is only slightly better than the annual average of 5.7% in the 1980s. But it can be argued that the 1980s growth was unsustainable, fueled by a buildup of external debt that culminated in the crisis of 1991. In sharp contrast, the growth in 1990s was accompanied by remarkable external stability, despite the East Asian crisis. Poverty also declined significantly in the post-reform period and at a faster rate than in the 1980s, according to some studies by Ravilian and Dutt. This was the decade when the fruits of economic reforms became visible in terms of performance of various economic indicators, the most important one in the Indian case being poverty, which is the touchstone of successful economic performance in an underdeveloped country. Figure shows the progress in reducing the head count poverty ratio, which is the proportion of the population below an officially defined poverty line. As is clear from the trend depicted in this figure, the slow growth and neglect of human development in the first 3 decades of the planning years led to a comprehensive failure in poverty alleviation. Between 1950s to 1977-78, as has been posited by Dutt and Ravilian in 2010, the head count ratio, as per various poverty calculation methodologies, was broadly constant and there was no progress in poverty reduction. This means, in terms of data, more than half the population of India was below the poverty line for almost 3 decades post its independence from the British rule. High population growth during this period meant large additions to the absolute number of poor people was also happening at the same time. Poverty ratios began to fall significantly in the fast growth period after 1980, but the rate of decline was still slow in comparison with, say, China. It again began to speed up during another super fast growth period in the economy from 2003 to 2010. The absolute number of poor people did not decline until 2004, but then fell quite rapidly. As is clear from the figure, India achieved success in reducing the poverty numbers, but quite late. Short-lived growth bubble. The global credit crisis that broke out in 2008 was the beginning of the slowdown that India had to face in just less than 2 decades from the commencement of the new economic reforms. India's growth slipped to 6.7% during 2008-9, but rebounded to more than 8% for the next 3 years, driven by the pre-existing momentum of the domestic consumption and investment. From 2011 to 2014, there was a sharp slowdown with growth slipping to 5% a year. On the domestic front, inflation, growth slowdown, jobless growth, and various corruption scandals all led to a halt in the growth process reaching higher levels. The proximate cause of the slowdown from 2011 was a collapse of corporate investment, which was fueled by 2 reasons. 1, it was a natural consequence of over-borrowing in the boom years. And second, there was a souring of the investment climate caused by the governance failures like corruption scandals and scams. This led to a dampening of investment and growth despite policies targeting macroeconomic stability. Another reason for the fizzling out of the reforms in the long run has been the performance of the Indian manufacturing sector, which accounts for very low levels of workforce and is characterized by a very high degree of informalization. The growth of Indian manufacturing is characterized by joblessness during the period 1991, and by and large, all the yearly and the industry-wise variations show the same results. While a few capital and skill-intensive industries recorded fast rates of growth of value-added, employment generation occurred largely in the unorganized sector, mainly in export-oriented industries such as garments and textiles. This is in sharp contrast with the effects of economic reforms of the Chinese economy, which was able not only to produce technologically advanced sectors, which gave globally and competitive edge to the economy, but also generate employment, which helped absorb the rural masses and lift them out from poverty dramatically. Instead of creating high-wage, high-skilled labor force, the Indian economy witnessed a large chunk of labor force working in high levels of informality and precarity without any social security, selling their labor power at very low wages. This labor force, characterized by low wages and low skills, low labor force participation rates of women, and high levels of precarity, made a huge obstacle for the laboring masses of this country to achieve higher levels of prosperity and welfare, as was initially promised by the reforms in 1991. These problems also underscore the non-inclusive nature of these reforms, which was a big problem for the Indian economy to achieve the goal of inclusive growth in the long run. Conclusion. As is clear from different parts of this lecture, all has not gone well with the story of neoliberal reforms in India. The very fact that in less than 2 decades, post the initiation of structural adjustment in the Indian economy, growth rates have slowed down, call for a broader inspection and investigation of the Indian growth model. Other South Asian countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh also seem to have gone down the same path. Like India, Bangladesh also started its experiments with neoliberal structural adjustment policies since the 1980s. Economic research points out that instead of distributing benefits among different societal groups, these reforms have brought an economic windfall mainly for the business and industrial class in Bangladesh. The vast majority of other societal groups and classes, the industrial and agricultural labor, small businesses, marginal and small farmers, and urban and rural poor are left out by the reform agenda, pointing to the non-inclusive nature of these reforms and the ever-widening disparities in income and wealth between different sections of the society. Pakistan's case is no different. Despite implementing the Washington Consensus in letter and spirit, privatization did not lead to a substantial increase in the national productive capabilities. Dear students, with this, I conclude this lecture, which critically evaluated the new economic policy of India, which was initiated in 1991. For a detailed treatment of this topic, I have recommended a reading list which can be used to gain more knowledge on the topic. Thank you.